Do you know the unspoken rules of your organization? If you're like most of us, you don't, or at least certainly not all of them. So, how does that affect your confidence and your overall performance? I am really excited to share this conversation with you, where I talk with Gorick Ng, author of the Unspoken Rules, about why it's so challenging for so many of us to confidently navigate our work environments. While most of you listening to this would identify as high achievers who want to get a proverbial A at work, you haven't been given the rubric, which leads to self-doubt, imposter syndrome, and other confidence challenges. Here, we break this down and offer strategies for individuals as well as leaders to empower ourselves to understand the unspoken rules in our workplaces and maximize our careers. Thank you so much, as always, for listening and sharing with your friends. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Gorick. I am so excited to have this conversation with you today. I know you and I have been chatting over time, and I'm really excited to bring this to a listening audience. So before we jump into the meat of it, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Sounds great. And Kim, I'm so glad that we're finally having this conversation. I feel like you and I are on the same wavelength about so many topics. So just really glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I'll start my intro way back when I was 14 years old and ended up writing my mom's and my own first resume. My mom was laid off from her sewing machine factory job, and I, as the person who knew how to get onto the internet, who knew how to speak English, became the person to go online, look for templates, copy and paste, and apply to hundreds of jobs on her behalf. And this, I start off as really the start of my story, because it was then that I realized that, wow, there's so much that school doesn't teach you and that no one really tells you about how to work the system, how to navigate the system. Because I applied to hundreds of jobs then, and I ended up getting zero callbacks. And it wasn't until I became a college student, a first-generation low-income college student at Harvard, that I started realizing that so many of my peers had this informal education growing up on how to put themselves out there, how to work the system, that I was never taught growing up. Things about networking, about putting yourself out there, about saying the right things to the right person at the right time in the right sequence, asking for referrals, asking for coffee chats. All of those things weren't apparent to me until I arrived in the workplace, when I started realizing that those who get pulled into high-profile assignments weren't necessarily the most competent. They were the ones who were known. And you have to be known to be remembered, and you have to be remembered to be rewarded and promoted. And it was then that I realized, wow, what if I could deconstruct what so many of us learn through trial and error into a step-by-step how-to guide? And that's what inspired me to eventually become an author and write a book called The Unspoken Rules, to hopefully demystify some of these quote-unquote unspoken rules of how to navigate your career.
I love that story so much, and so appreciate the distinction you make between people who've been sort of, I think of it as like marinating in this because they had the privilege of having parents who've been in this world for a while. And then there are others, and I would include myself in this population as well, who really just figured it out as they went along, and often in painful ways. And what's fascinating to me about the way that you're describing it, and I'm sure that it wasn't always painless for you, but the way that I'm picturing you approaching this is very much from the balcony. Like what's interesting is that I think a lot of people who are in a situation where they feel this disconnect or this sense of anxiety around, I don't know how the system works, would often translate that into, I don't belong in this system, not necessarily to look at it through that more holistic lens of, maybe it's the system, right? Or maybe there's another way to think about the system. So did you consciously think about it that way? Or do you have a sense as to what your mindset was at the time when you started to realize these things?
I'd say the moment that all of this pain and struggle and trial and error came to the forefront was when I returned to Harvard as a career advisor. And it was an interesting look at the first generation low income college student experience because I was, for the first time, coming back as an advisor versus the person who was going through the system. And it was then that I met a student who told me that he felt like he had just arrived at a hockey game with a baseball bat.
Interesting.
So he was swinging and swinging and swinging, not realizing that he was playing a very different game than everybody else. And it was that one conversation that led me to realize, oh my goodness, that's exactly how I felt coming into the college system, entering my first job, feeling like everybody else was playing hockey while I was playing baseball.
That's a really great way to capture it. I'm sure any people listening are thinking, wow, that's my story, right? So you talk about this idea of deconstructing. Like, what did it actually involve for you to think about it in this way?
Frankly, it wasn't a process to start. It was just a series of, frankly, venting sessions when I first began. So I remember in my first job, I would spend a lot of my nights and weekends asking questions, but really venting to friends, asking questions like, is adulting really meant to be this hard? That is it just meant to be, or is it just a fact of life that nothing we learn in school or very little of what we learn in school is actually what's useful in the real world? And what managers expect of us is often what's not communicated to us. And one venting session led to another, led to another, led to another, until I started realizing, oh, wow, it didn't matter that you worked in insurance or healthcare or higher ed, or you were working as a plumber. We were all, as early career professionals, facing the same things. And the the meme that I feel like encapsulated how we all felt was this meme online with a manager speaking to an employee, and the caption reads, "I can't believe you forgot to start the thing that I forgot to tell you to do." And that just really spoke to, well, so much of what's expected of us is never actually communicated to us. And it's up to us to read between the lines. And a chapter in my book is called Read Between the People, to understand what people are really expecting of us.
And I think when we talk about imposter syndrome or we talk about self-doubt more generally, so much of that is rooted, and you and I were talking about this a little bit before we hit record, in this anxiety around, how do I do this the right way? I mean, so many of us were so motivated in our academic years to get an A, to get the highest GPA we could get, to make sure that we were making our teachers and professors happy. And now we find ourselves in this system where we don't get adequate, effective feedback most of the time. We aren't taught a lot of the things that, like you said, are expected of us. And we look around and we see other people that, to our minds, aren't really performing as well or aren't as committed as we are, getting ahead and getting these opportunities that we feel like we should be the ones to get. And so it creates this sense of, maybe I don't belong here. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm doing something wrong and I don't know how to process that because there isn't anything to really wrap my arms around. So your book is fascinating in that it actually does give something to wrap your arms around. Like, how did you get from, this is just this very general experience that so many of us have, to here's the step-by-step process for how to tackle it?
It began with one interview followed by another until I ended up interviewing over 500 professionals across geographies, industries, and job types, from Uber drivers to nurses to professors to architects to paper mill machine operators. So it took a lot of these conversations for me to one, see the differences across different working contexts, but more importantly, see the commonalities. And certainly one of the commonalities is no matter where you are, what's expected of you is not communicated to you explicitly. The second thing that was apparent to me was a framework that took some time to uncover, but that now has since become the basis of my book. And it's the framework that I call the 3 Cs. And it stands for competence, commitment, and compatibility. Where when you show up as a professional, it doesn't matter what industry or job type you're in, the people around you are sizing you up and they're asking themselves 3 questions. The first question is the question of, can you do this job well? Which is the question of, are you competent? The second question is, are you excited to be here and to grow with us? Which is the question of, are you committed? And the third question is the question of, do we get along? Which is the question of, are we compatible? So are you competent? Are you committed? And are you compatible? The 3 Cs. Your job, frankly, all of our jobs, including the CEO of an organization, is to convince the people around them to answer yes to all 3 questions all the time. And so it's interesting to hear you use the word committed earlier, because depending on the organization, what it takes to express competence, commitment, and compatibility can be very different. So I remember interviewing, for example, a cashier at a cinema. And you'd think that in a job like that, it's all about counting the right change, making sure you show up to your shift on time. But this individual ended up being perceived as someone who was uncommitted to their role. Why? Well, it's because in between shifts, this individual didn't take the time to interact and to socialize with their coworkers. And this wasn't as a result of them not being committed. It's just that they didn't realize that actually being a team player, quote unquote, which also speaks to compatibility, was very much based on not just putting your head down and doing the job that's expected of you, but there's also this hidden expectation that you'll be interacting and getting to know your coworkers. And what this looks like depends on the organization, but it's important, no matter where you are, to uncover what it looks like and sounds like to express competence, commitment, and compatibility.
I love that you have a framework for thinking about it, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about all of the people that I work with, especially, the achievers who are so focused on the competence piece. In that, when you're in that mindset of, I want to perform at the highest level, I want to prove myself, there's so much focus on just doing the work. And then that commitment and compatibility maybe inadvertently fall by the wayside or don't feel as high priority in a life that's full of other responsibilities, right? And so I think it's so important that you frame that as a series of things that we need to demonstrate, and not just that one, like, can I do the job piece of it?
Right. And to further add some complexity, but hopefully some nuance to this 3 Cs framework, these 3 Cs don't exist as a binary. So it's not a matter of, are you committed or not? It's actually on a spectrum where it's important to express the right dose of commitment while not overshooting the mark and coming across as threatening or as wanting to take your coworker's job. So one of these unspoken rules of the workplace is to step up without overstepping. And what this means is looking left, looking right, uncovering something that others haven't done yet. So what I think of as an unoccupied swim lane, and then volunteering to occupy that swim lane, but first making sure that it's unoccupied. So I have another story in my book of this individual who worked at a community center and who noticed that the storage room was a total mess. What this individual did was, well, out of just their free time, go in there and start cleaning up the place. And you'd think that this person's taking initiative. They're showing commitment, until the supervisor, I believe the operations coordinator, came by and ended up huffing and puffing because this was their responsibility. Even though they weren't doing this job all that well, they were completely neglecting the closet, they still saw it as their swim lane. And so this individual's good intent ended up coming across as, well, negative impact. So It's important to be committed, but not so committed. And that also depends on where you work and who you're around.
So when you describe that, I'm the first word that comes into my mind is politics, right? I think that when you're in the workplace, there is that territoriality or that sensitivity around some of these things. And it's easy to come into a situation with enthusiasm, with new ideas, and to think, oh, I've got the answer to this problem. I'll just come right in and not necessarily be thoughtful of, well, whose responsibility is it today, or why hasn't it been addressed yet, or who thinks they own this, right? So what would your suggestion be for how to ferret out that information?
Yeah, and this speaks to compatibility as well, where when you're new to a team, new to an organization, you almost need to do what a CEO is expected to do, which is to go around and do one-on-ones with each of your coworkers and to ask them, hey, what are the things that are at the top of your priority list over the next 3 months, 6 months? Tell me more about your work. How can I be helpful? And you might think of this as something that a CEO might put on their to-do list in their first 100 days. They might go on this listening tour, or someone who's new to public office might do this with their constituents. But this is actually just as important for an individual if you want to build trust and unlock opportunity. So as part of these conversations, what you'll quickly understand, hopefully, is this is this individual's formal responsibilities. This is their informal set of responsibilities. This is who's who. This is who's loyal to whom. And how this is the space I'm supposed to occupy, and this is the unoccupied swim lane that I can potentially take on. All of this, no one will tell you. You have to go around introducing yourself to people and really getting to know them in order for you to uncover these answers for yourself. In an ideal world, you're doing this early enough so that you can avoid some of these, for lack of a better word, landmines that can come your way after you're not so new.
Yeah, I use that word all the time too. I think it's a perfect way to capture the potential of, making a misstep when you're in that moment. And I think that it's also, I know obviously the earlier the better, but I also, for anybody who's listening and thinking, oh no, I'm in the middle of a job that I've had it's never too late. I don't think. Like, I often think about this too as an opportunity when you're starting a new project or you're changing your responsibilities in some way. Whenever there's a change, it introduces a new opportunity to do what I call is like reintroducing yourself and sort of reestablishing what are the rules or ground rules of how we're going to be working together. And so I would imagine that these kinds of conversations could be perfect for those types of dynamic shifts.
I love the idea of reintroducing yourself, and it very nicely aligns with advice that I'd heard from a senior attorney that I had interviewed for my work. I actually ended up speaking at this corporate law firm as part of their new associate onboarding and training program on how to step up without overstepping and how to be proactive in a world where no one actually tells you the formula to being proactive. And what this individual told me about was, well, one, no one actually teaches you how to be a lawyer. They teach you how to think about the law in law school. That was the first thing. And it seems like every law firm and every experienced attorney has since told me that as well. But more specific to the situation, in school, you are handed your grades on a periodic basis. So you just have to look at the top, let's say, right-hand corner of your assignment to see where you are. If there's a curve in your class, that's often shared as well of which percentile you're in. So you basically know whether you're on track. However, in the workplace, that's often not going to be shared with you, even though how you're really performing is something people are thinking about on a daily basis. It just might not be written. It just exists in the minds of the people around you. And what the senior attorney told me was, one, you have to ask for feedback, but we often hear that advice. More specifically, though, it's important to ask for advice during and after every assignment, deliverable, or project. So at this law firm, you're probably not going to get all that useful a set of feedback if you went up to an attorney and said, do you have any feedback for me? Often the easy answer is going to be no, you're doing great, even though that may not be true. The key to getting specific feedback is to say, how do you think that meeting went? I feel like maybe I could have spoken up more, or I could have explained this topic better. What are your reactions? So giving people a sense of how you're self-reflecting opens the door for others to react as well. In the military, people might call this an after action review, an AAR, for example. Well, that's something that you have to take control of in every project to say, how do you think that went? I feel like I could have done better in these areas, would love to get your reactions. And in law, but I would say that this is true for every profession, your feedback often will be task-based versus sort of more broadly. So coming back to law or anywhere where you're working, for example, on the Microsoft suite of Excel or PowerPoint or Word, you're actually getting feedback. It's in the form of margin comments or track changes. And so even though you're not getting formal feedback, you're getting feedback nevertheless. And there's this unspoken expectation that whatever people ask you to do this prior time, they're going to expect that you'll apply for every future time. So I had this also happen with a sales leader that I spoke to who invited some of his interns to a number of sales calls, expecting but not verbalizing that, hey, when I invite you to this meeting, what I'm really expecting you to do is listen, take notes, observe how I sell so that you can do it on your own next time. And so fast forward several weeks, the sales leader ended up saying to one of the interns, hey, how about you lead the call? At which point the intern thought and said, well, what do I do? And that led to, of course, the misunderstanding of, well, why do you think I brought you to all those meetings? So that's also something that unfortunately could have been mitigated if we had just talked about it.
Well, and that actually leads me to a question that I don't know if you have an answer to, but I'm sure you have thoughts, is you've talked to so many people about this. You've clearly gotten a lot of data on this, right? Is there a rethinking, or is there any opportunity to solve this problem by having some of the conversations that are not having? Like, is anyone thinking about doing this from the top down as opposed to from the bottom up? Or do you think it's just a matter of, well, this is how I came into the system and I don't really consciously think about this, and I'm just trying to get the work done, so I'm not really being creative about how to communicate? Like, do you think it's more so a function of people aren't taught how to do this, or why are we not solving this problem, I guess?
Yeah, we're not solving this problem because we either don't realize just how much of a business impact this has, or don't we don't even have the language or awareness to know that this is a problem. So I'll first talk about the issue as it relates to the heart, and then the issue as it relates to the head. So when it comes to the heart, I mean, so many of us, I hope those listening in on our conversation are flashing back to moments when they had to learn through trial and error. The challenge is so many of these unspoken rules are kind of like looking both ways before crossing the street. It's not obvious when you're in kindergarten that it's important, but then the minute you learn it, it just becomes second nature. And the jargon that people often use for this is the curse of expertise or the curse of knowledge, which is to say that if you want to be a great tennis player, don't learn from Serena Williams. She's going to just say, swing the bat. You need to learn from someone who is likely also at a novice level or who understands how hard it can be to even just hold your racket correctly. That's kind of the knowing gap. And then there's another awareness gap as it relates to just how important this is for an organization. So what the consequence is of all the issues that we described is slow onboarding time, low employee engagement, and low employee retention. So I've spoken to so many employees who will tell me, it's my first day in my job. All I got was my email account, my direct deposit paperwork filled out, and a calendar invitation for this random thing that I'm supposed to show up at 2 p.m. What's expected of me? And then I don't know a soul. I don't know what's expected of me. I don't even know who my manager is, let alone how I get an A in this job. As much as I want an A, no one's actually given me the rubric. And that leads to the manager eventually getting frustrated because they're looking at this individual and saying, oh, they're not going above and beyond. They're not asking questions. They're not taking ownership. They're not taking initiative. And well, this speaks to what you just referred to as, well, this is not just an individual problem. This is not just a matter of self-help. This is a matter of leaders needing to do more, all of us needing to help. And what ends up happening is leaders, just as a consequence of them needing to express competence and commitment to their superiors, neglecting the people that report to them. And so what they don't realize is actually speaking these unspoken rules can help your employees get up to speed more quickly, actually know what the heck you're expecting them to do on a daily basis, understand that doing your job is only part of your job, going above and beyond is actually the baseline expectation. And if people know, in the words of an intern, I want to get an A. I just have never been handed the rubric on how to get an A. You'll quickly realize that actually your employees will perform better. And if they perform better, they'll feel better about themselves and their place in your organization. And if all of these come together, they're probably also more likely to stay in your organization long-term too. People just don't maybe make the connection between speaking these unspoken rules and the bottom line.
That is so important. And that leads me to a question around the sort of diversity and inclusion aspect of this problem that we're talking about, because I think that if the experience were universal, it would probably be different. But because there's certain people who, by virtue of their demographics or by virtue of their connections or whatever the case may be, the legacy of having grown up in families where they have been taught some of this, they may have access in different ways that they don't even realize is different from the access that other people have. And so what it creates is, I'm going to go back to like the idea of the myth of the meritocracy, right? Of like, well, some people get it, so why doesn't everybody? If I can see what I'm expecting to see in a portion of the population, and I don't see it in someone who maybe is first generation, hasn't had any of the socialization around some of this, I might assume that that's a person that's not committed, as opposed to assuming that that's a person who is an opportunity, there's an opportunity there to mentor them and really bring them into the system. And so I'm curious your thoughts on just who gets left behind and how some of this really does perpetuate the unfairness of the system today.
I'm glad you're asking this question. And I think that those who get left behind are actually broader than we think. So if we're thinking about corporate America at large, we can say that maybe there are those who are first generation professionals, so the first in their families to hold a white collar job. But if I think about my so-called audience, or who has found my content to resonate with them most, I'd say it's actually anyone who feels like an outsider to their immediate environment. So anyone who feels different from the immediate team. So I'll give you a few examples. We often think of diversity and inclusion as, for example, women working in a predominantly male team. I've actually spoken to nurses who are men and who are working in a predominantly women-led team, in which case they feel like the outsider. Or we know that, for example, that in teaching, that there are many more women, especially at the elementary and middle school levels. And I've spoken to also teachers who are men, who find themselves in such an environment and struggling to fit in because the conversations that are being had in the lunchroom are just very different. I've spoken with folks who are new immigrants to the United States, who feel like an outsider just because of a language barrier, because they don't know anyone, because the corporate culture is different. But I've also spoken to Americans who've worked, for example, in the Middle East, who find themselves being the outsider. And so this really came to the forefront for me when I met my significant other's parents for the first time, and they speak a different language. I found myself using Google Translate and having to ask my partner, what do I say? How do I say it? When do I say it? And these were really casual conversations like, how was your day? Or tell me about yourself. And it was and this was after my book had launched, where I started realizing and really reliving the stressful moment of being a new outsider to an environment, where I thought to myself, oh my goodness, for the first time in a long time, even just saying hello is now all of a sudden a stress-inducing experience, and me having to go onto Google Translate. So for anyone who may be interacting with their in-laws or their neighbors or their cousins-in-law or what have you, and they might come from a different background, and you're finding yourself feeling like an outsider, that's probably the experience of someone in your organization right now. They just might be the invisible one because they feel like an outsider.
That's such a great way to think about it. I think I have two thoughts in response to that. Number one is that this is something that can be sort of episodic in our lives. So maybe we don't feel that way in this very moment because we've gotten comfortable where we are, but there's no guarantee that we won't be in this situation at another point in time. And so it's important to really think about what might be coming down the road and be more proactive in our thinking. The other thing I think about is the invisible people who are being left behind for, I don't mean to sound disrespectful, but just to sort of characterize the people who are most impacted by this are also probably least likely to ask for help because that fear of, I don't want to expose the fact that I don't know what I'm doing. I'm really self-conscious about this. And so do you have tips? And probably the first one is read the book, but beyond that, like, do you have thoughts on, if I'm the outsider, if I truly feel like an outsider, it feels that much more risky to raise my hand and say, I don't understand this system. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is to realize that you're not alone. That I was just doing a session with a large Fortune 50 tech company, and I asked the audience, how many times have you had an idea or a question, but you didn't share it out of a fear that it's a stupid question? And 90% of people said that they've had that experience before. So it was a 90-10 split. So just know that you're not alone is really the first step. The second is, and I've got lots of these fill in the blanks or Mad Libs in my book of how do you speak in these situations. And one of them is a framework that I call do and show your homework. So instead of saying, Kim, I'm confused about this, I can instead say, Kim, I'm working on this. I know this, but I'm not so sure about this. How should I be approaching it? Should I be approaching it in option A, option B, or option C? I'm leaning towards option B. Let me know if you feel differently. So I'll unpack that to hopefully make it easier to apply. Where instead of just saying, these are all the things I don't know, there's an opportunity for you to show your homework of, this is what I know, so give me some credit, kind of like in school. This is what I'm not so sure about. That's number one. And the number two is the more that you can frame a question, not as an open-ended question, but as a closed-ended question, as a multiple choice question, or as a multiple choice question with a default, the more you'll come across as if, and it's true, it's not just a matter of perception, but it's reality as well, that you've put some thought into this. So when it comes to asking questions, how do I define a smart question or a good question? Well, it's a question that is framed as if you couldn't have Googled for the answer for yourself. So this is true even for a job interview, where I'd say probably the number one question that gets asked in job interviews is the question of, and by the way, this is at the end of a job interview, so you'll inevitably get the question of, do you have any questions for me? And I'd say probably top three questions. Number one is probably going to be, tell me about the culture of your firm. In which case, I mean, just the fact, if anyone is hearing this and maybe smiling or nodding, well, it's unfortunately the question that gets asked probably the most. And it comes across as if it's a generic question because you're not doing and showing your homework. Where instead, if I said, I was reading your mission statement and I was also reading a recent press release that cited this, This really stands out to me for these reasons. This also raises the question of this. Can you tell me more about this? All of a sudden, just by definition, it's not a stupid question because you're showing that, hey, I've reached the limits of what I could investigate on my own. Help me fill in the blanks.
I love that. You're sort of adding context to the question in a way that demonstrates that, to your point, that it's thoughtful, right? That it's not, I hate to even say this because I know that most people aren't coming from this place, but it's not lazy in terms of like, you've clearly demonstrated that you've done as much as you could have done. And now you're bringing it to somebody who has to fill in those blanks.
Right. Yeah. It's all about asking, to your point, a thoughtful question or a satisfying question or a well-researched question. And you don't have to have done an exhaustive literature review. You just need to show that you've put in even a minimal amount of effort. So by definition, this is a good question.
Yeah, that is really helpful, I think, for thinking about a lot of conversations, not just the asking for help, but one of the things that really stood out to me when you and I first met and you were doing a presentation for, the Boston College women's group was just the way in which you provide I almost think of it as like good, better, best options, right? Of like, you could say this, but what's even better is if you say all of these other things too, which is exactly what I think people are looking for. And although we'll never have the benefit of perfect recipes for every type of situation, it does provide this really foundational level of like, formulas that you can tinker around with depending on, to your point, like what is the cultural value within my organization? What does my manager demonstrate in terms of their values? And then, so how can I adjust this framework accordingly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to your earlier point about, is this just a matter of self-help or is this also a message for leaders? I've yet to meet a leader who has told me that they don't want people to ask questions. At the same time, I've also never met a leader who has told me that they want questions that people could have Googled on their own. So if we just think about what leaders and managers want, it's to not have their time be wasted, but it's also to make sure that things get done. So even just sharing the language of, hey, let's speak the unspoken rules and let's make it just a norm around here that when you're asking questions, it's important to do and show your homework. That's the formula for getting an A around here. That will make your employees less stressed out and less anxious, just as it will do the same for you.
I love that because I do always try to look at it from what's our individual responsibility and what's our collective responsibility for solving the problem at a more macro level. And I think for anyone who's listening who manages people, it's such a great thing to think about is, am I being clear? Am I taking things for granted? Am I making assumptions about what this other person knows or understands? And to just really err on the side of, especially in the beginning, over communicating what those expectations are. I often joke, but I mean this seriously. When I talk about imposter syndrome, I say manage your team as if everyone has imposter syndrome, because most of them do, and no one will ever tell you, right? And so it's the same thing as assume that nobody knows these rules that you know. Assume that it's a blank slate and you can use your own authentic style and how you communicate these and how you engage your team. But I think you're going to end up having a much more productive, much more engaged team if you start with the premise that they have a lot that they don't have. There's a lot that they don't have access to.
I love that. I have this framework later on in the book that speaks to best practices for delivering presentations. And one of the first things to keep in mind is assume that people don't know what you know. There are other ones as well that might be that are out of scope for what you just shared. For example, assume that people haven't read what you just sent them. People assume that people don't remember what they agreed to previously. And assume that people probably aren't paying attention to you when you're speaking. So there's other things to keep in mind, which is why it's important to tell people what you're about to say it, and then remind people of what you just said. But specific to your point, it's important to not make assumptions around what people know. Just assume that they don't.
Absolutely. And, I could stay here with you all day. Sincerely, there's so much more that I could ask you. But as we're wrapping up, first of all, how can people find you? What are sort of the places for people to go if they want more of you and your great work?
Sure thing. The best place to go is my website, which has additional resources, links to my book, links on how to engage me for speaking engagements at your organization, and of course, how to connect with me on social media. All of that is housed at gorick.com. That's GORICK.com. I'm active on all the different social media channels as well. Got an email list. I'd encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to reach out and to stay in touch.
Perfect. I'm going to link to that in the show notes. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
For itself, it's about being heard, being seen, being remembered, and being rewarded. And all of those things need to be there for you to accelerate your career, to unlock opportunity, to not be invisible. And the key to doing so is to look left, look right, observe the behaviors of those around you, and to see how they're expressing their 3 C's of competence, commitment, and compatibility. And my message to leaders is look at your team and ask yourself, who are the people who seem the quietest, who seem the least engaged, who seem like they just don't get it? And assume positive intent for a moment and ask yourself, okay, no one wakes up in the morning telling themselves, how can I make the life of my manager as difficult as possible? Everyone wants to do good work. Everyone wants to be their best self. Let's just assume that for a moment. What unspoken rule do they not get that is leading them down this path of not knowing what they don't know? And what can you as a leader do to just have a conversation with them about, hey, when I was in your shoes, this is what I encountered. These are my struggles. This is how I encountered it. Just having that conversation and sharing your own story can mean the difference between this person not only just being invisible, but feeling alone and potentially being one of your high performers.
I love that so much. Thank you so much, Gorick. This has been so helpful.
Thank you so much, Kim. Love this conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.